Hello, I'm Matt. I'm going to talk about XAML. Does everybody know what XAML is? Anybody not? That's the easier one. Anyone not? Okay, so XAML is a UI definition language used for mobile desktop applications on .NET. So it's used by WPF, WinUI, UWP, Xamarin Forms, Maui, those sorts of things. And I've sort of subtitled it 2008 or 2022 because people write XAML now the way they did in 2008 when it first came out. And I think if we think about XAML as a programming language and we write it with a kind of the mind of a programming language, we write better XAML. And I'm going to compare it with C# as a reference because I'm sure you're .NET developers or interested in .NET, and therefore I'm going to assume you know C#. If you don't know C#, just smile and nod along, we'll be grand. So XAML is not as old as C#, but it's had a lot fewer versions. It doesn't get a lot of love. As highlighted by this quote, so Maui and WinUI don't have designers to design your UI, and because if you're doing UI, you want visual things, but you've got no designer, and almost every day on message boards and GitHub repos and mailing lists, I see people complaining about it, and what's the time? About an hour and a half ago, I was talking with someone from Microsoft, and they said, yeah, we're still getting that every day. Everyone complains we don't have it. But so, Microsoft know people don't like it, but they don't invest in XAML. We could build loads of tools to make XAML better, and ask me later and I'll show you some of them. But we'll do other things instead. So some people don't like XAML and they go, well, we could just use C#. And yes, you can. And there are times when C# is a much better alternative than XAML, but that's a grid with 2 bits of text in it. And it's not, I don't think that's particularly easy to understand or more useful or more descriptive. So I like to think, what do we want from XAML? Let's take a step back. We want, what do we want from any programming language? We want it to be easy to read, easy to understand. We want great tooling. We want to be able to modify it. We want to be able to maintain it, all those sorts of things. And we're going to take some lessons from C#. To do that, we're going to think about the single responsibility principle. I know Solid gets some criticism lately, but single responsibility principle still generally a good thing. I'm going to talk about the dry principle about repeating yourself and that being a bad thing. So let's start. Let's think about some UI, and for our UI, we are going to put 3 buttons in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, just like that. And we might write some code like that, and all the examples in the docs will tell you, do some code like that. But I think that's really bad. I think that's bad because this code is doing 2 things. So each of these is a button, and it's saying what should be on the button, what do we do when we click it, but it's also doing where should we be, what should be the layout, what does it look like, how does it fit in with everything else. And that's bad because, well, there's a lot of text there, a lot more than we need, but also, let's say I decide I want to put a B button between my C and my A buttons. So now I have to put another 6 lines of code in, I have to modify these other buttons, and I have to faff about with what's happening with margins so it all still looks consistent and even. I think this is better. I've got a row of buttons which takes care of all the layout, and my buttons, just my buttons. Some content, what you do with it. I want to add another button. Well, that's now really, really easy. I want to change the buttons around. That's really easy. I don't have to worry about moving values from other buttons. Great, and my row of buttons just takes care of it. And what is this magic row of buttons thing? It's just a stack panel with a couple of properties. Now this is overly simplified because this is a quick demo, but I use this all the time and it makes the code much easier to understand, to read, and to change. I don't know about you, but I tend not to write code once and never touch it again. We're always updating code, always changing things, adding functionality, rebrand comes along. There's one project I work on from time to time, and like twice a year they do a rebrand because they do sponsorships and things. And the new sponsor comes in, re-sponsor the whole app, we have to reskin everything, that we can easily change things, really powerful. So that was my stack panel with my row of buttons. Notice the name, row of buttons. It's really, really, really clear what that is. Do you have any doubt? It's not a column, it's all about buttons, okay? Here are some other common names you might see. I have a medium left-right margin. Well, if this wasn't an example of a bad thing to do, you might go, yeah, that's fine, so a medium left-right margin. I'll go, well, what does medium mean? Where should I use it? What happens if I want to change where this is used? Do I change the resource, the definition of what those margins are? Do I go around everywhere and find where I'm using left-right margins, work out which ones to change? How do I know by looking at this code that it's using the right thing? There's lots of ambiguity there, and it makes it harder to maintain. My action red button. That seems sensible, until we have a rebrand, and actually we want that to be green. So do we change the button, our custom type, to say, well, it says its name is red, but we're actually going to make it green? Or do we make another button and go change everywhere we're using it to use the new button? Or worse, change that code and rename it and faff about? No, because action red button is a bad name, okay? This is a circular button and it's red. That's all that matters. But why do we use a red button? Where do we use a red button? Is it because it's what we want for the default option? Let's call it default button. It becomes really obvious we're using it in the right place at the right time. If we want to change the styling of our default button, one change, not changes throughout the application. Let's look at another example. So this is an item in a list. For example, a little data template. We've got a box, we've got an image, 3 bits of text. You'll see similar things, loads and loads of apps, lists with things in it. Okay, nice and simple. And we might write something like that. And all over the world, all over the internet, all over GitHub, all over code bases everywhere is lots of code like that. But as you might have guessed, I don't think that's great. Let's call out a couple of things. So, background color sea green. I'm guessing we're using the sea green color all over the place. Okay, but where all over the place? Why do we use it in certain places and not others? What happens if we want to change it? Well, we'd have to go and change it everywhere, and that would be a pain. Spacing for, what does that mean? Where should we use spacing for? If we decide we want to change spacing in the app, which places do we change it in? What's this margin thing going on? Instead, why don't we have resources to define these things? If we've got this color which we're going to use in a bunch of places, let's give it a meaningful name so we know where to use it, when to use it, and we can change the value if need be. We've got our margin for our items. I've called it an item margin. Anywhere within the application where we've got a list of things where we called items, well, their margin is always the item margin. We can look at the code and it's clear why that's there. We have intra-item spacing, the spacing between the bits of text in an item. Well, isn't that going to be the same throughout the entire app? Yes, it is. Okay, so let's have one definition of that. So if we ever need to change that, we can change it in one place and it propagates throughout the app. And you might go, well, I'd never need to make such a change. And I'd go, well, what about if you needed to add an accessibility feature to increase the spacing between the words to make it easier for people to read? Okay, what you don't want to be doing is having code that goes and finds every single control and adjusts the spacing. Let's just load a different resource there, different styles, and have that propagate automatically through the app just by having a different version of the resource. Let's look at other things. So these labels have some properties on them, setting the font size and attributes about them. Yeah, you don't want to be doing that because you don't want to be doing that all over the place. You don't want to have lots of definitions of this is the text size to use here, this is the weight. I worked on one app, it was like 13 pages and there were 30 different versions of text in terms of typefaces, sizes and attributes we were applying. It was ridiculous and it was a right old pain to write because it wasn't designed consistently. If we define some types and some styles and use them consistently, yes, and you will see lots of examples like this. You know, I know that if it's going to be the title, I use my title text resource. That seems obvious, but we can still be even better than this. What we can do is think about it differently. So I think about this like unnecessary casting. So imagine, getting click happy, imagine we had a person and we had a student. We're in a university, that's convenient. And I want to do something with a student. Would you pass in a person and just cast it to a student? No, you know I always want a student. Give me a student and we'll work with that. Don't cast unnecessarily if you don't need to. So let's think back to this, where we've got our labels and our styles. Instead, let's just have a type called title, which has our title text. If I need something in my UI that's label, and I want it to be the title of something, well, I'll just use my title type. Much simpler, and got other different text types, and I've created one for my standard item border. Taken all that stuff about the border, which I probably use in more than one place, just combine it. And again, this isn't complicated. Oh, I've just created a border and applied a style to it. I created a label and applied a style to it. Really easy to do. And you might go, yeah, but that's a pain if I've got lots and lots of things to do. And I said I am a fan of tools. So quick showing of a tool. I know that's hard to see, but I can't make it bigger because I can't get them side by side. So come closer and you can see what's happening. So on the left, we have a really basic dictionary with some styles defined, so a standard button, an error button, and just a implicitly typed button. And on the right, we have that button, so that standard button type and the error button type. And if you look at the very top, you see that it's auto-generated. And if you can, if you take my word for it, over here, the properties for this file, I've got a custom tool called create type for XAML style. And you can guess what happens. So imagine I define another style in my app. Let's call it a super button. I don't know why. Well, let's just call it the default button. Call it default button. Let's say that's going to be green just to make it different. And what I do is I just save, and it's automatically created that thing for me. I can have loads and loads of styles, all different types, just write that little bit of code for me. If you were doing the same thing over and over again in C#, you might write a tool to do it for you. Well, why doesn't that apply to other apps? That's really easy to do, if you know how. But it's something you could easily do. So there we go. That was really fast. I didn't look at the time. But I'm going to say, so what I talked about, modern XAML, just like any other programming language, think about layout and what you're doing differently. No magic numbers, that's basing 4. You wouldn't have numbers all through your C# code. You define a constant somewhere and reference that. Do the same thing. Think about the naming. Yes, you want your naming to be indicate where and why it should be used, not just a description of what it does. If I had a method which I use to calculate tax and I called it add 20%, that's fine, but it gets really confusing when the tax rate changes, or I use my add 20% somewhere else to do something that isn't related to tax, and then tax rate changes and it gets really confusing. Just really specific names, lots of short types, get rid of duplication, build the tools. I'm going to jump back here. It's easier to read. I've got rid of 8 unnecessary properties. I've defined 4 custom types, but it's really clear to understand. There's no magic numbers. It's straightforward. I can come in and go, oh, stack layout, I know what that is. I know what these types are. Simple. Thank you. And I've got loads of other stuff I could show you if you care about XAML later on. Thank you.